Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our February POGO call. Today, we've got a great panel lined up for you to discuss how contracting authorities set their social value priorities in their contracts. And I'm really delighted to welcome our guest co-chair for today's meeting, who is Andrea OCallaghan. She's a social value advisor to the Strategic Investment Board in Northern Ireland. And she has joined the Go Lab as a Fellow of Practice for 2022. So we're delighted to have Andrea working with us, and particularly delighted with the panel that she's going to be running for us today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Andrea to set the scene for today's discussion. Welcome and thank you.
Thanks, Anne, and welcome everyone. I am delighted to be hosting a session, my first sort of official task in the Fixing Fellow role. And I just want to start off by thanking our panelists in advance for what I know will be a very interesting discussion. Today, as Anne said, we are exploring how public sector bodies identify and prioritise their social value outcomes, and in particular how they link these at an individual contract level and with the broader policy outcomes that they are focused on achieving. We are also going to be looking at how governments build capacity in this area, and especially whether or not it's sufficient to focus this capacity building effort on just procurement functions, or whether there's a need to upskill a range of other stakeholders, for example, commissioners, contract managers, suppliers, etc. We do, I'm delighted to say, have an expert panel who are going to provide insights into the different approaches to these issues across the devolved administrations. And then we're going to widen out the lens and get an international perspective on how these issues are being managed within the government of New South Wales in Australia. And then finally, offering their expert knowledge in response to our panelists, we have Gillian Blake, partner at Stone King, Claire Fitzgerald, who is from King's College London, and of course Rory MacDonald, research associate at the Go Lab. So it is a jam-packed session. We have so much to cover, and I'm not going to say anything further because I want to leave as much time at the end for plenty of questions and comments on what we've heard today. So I'm going to hand over to our first panelist, Joe Mitchell, who is going to talk us through the approach of the Scottish Government to these.
Hi, afternoon everyone, and thanks for the invite. As Andrew said, my name is Joe Mitchell and I lead on what's called Sustainable Procurement Policy in Scottish Government. And I think we've got quite a lot of experience in the field that Andrew was referring to. It's grown up over a long period of time. I started working on this about 2003, to be honest, and it was 2008 when we first published what was our Community Benefits and Procurement Report. And over time, we've developed things like legislation, the Procurement Reform Act, which has a sustainable procurement duty, and alongside that, developed an approach to how to actually work out what the risks and opportunities are in both at an organisational level and at a project level. And what we did was we kind of linked those two things. We linked the practice and the approach to compliance with the legislation, and we continue to do that. We've done a mixture of things, frankly. We're very fortunate in Scotland. We have something called the National Performance Framework, and public bodies funding is derived, so there's a line of sight from Scottish governments or Scotland's purpose and outcomes through to public bodies. So what you have, for example, at local authority level is you'll have a local outcome improvement plan, which will be a priority for a local authority, but there'll be a line of sight back up to the Scottish governments and to the purpose and outcomes. Similarly, in our procurement reform legislation, we have a requirement for public bodies to set out a strategy of how they will use their procurement to comply with their local and national priorities, and then annually to report on how they're doing with this. So that gives you quite a strong line of sight. When we were developing what was based on the United Nations Environment program approach. We did lots of training. So we trained around 650, 700 procurement people across Scotland. And what was most valuable when we were doing that, this was face-to-face at the time, it was a huge project between 2011 and 2016, was that we would bring critical friends, we'd invite non-procurement people into the room, and that gave them a better understanding of public procurement, but also gave procurement a wider understanding of how they might play into achieving priorities such as equality and things like that. In terms of our tools, they're really kind of fundamental, and we put them onto a website a couple of years ago. We sort of moved them onto an Excel spreadsheet finally. And so what happens is there's a prioritization methodology, which is about how you can allocate your resources at an organizational level. So you look across your portfolio for the coming year, number of years, and actually see the big ticket items that are coming up. And through that, you can actually say, well, we really need to, we've got, for us, it's quite often there's a heat and buildings that we're going to relet. And so that's quite a high priority contract. There's lots of things we can do there. And then at an individual project level, there's a sort of a sense check that you can do that considers the same socioeconomic and environmental considerations, but just specific to the particular requirement. So you've kind of got the two levels. And then once you've actually worked that out, there's a part of what we call the sustainability test, which is the lower tariff product. Is actually where in the procurement process you might address these things, whether you should be looking at excluding bidders, which we really most of the time don't want to do. We want to encourage people to do things well, whether you address things through the tender, the specification, or whether it's most change coming away through contract management and KPIs. So it's kind of, it's all kind of grouped together under the sustainable procurement portfolio, but as I say, it's quite fortunate because we've got this really strong link to the National Performance Framework and outcomes. I would say it's really not just about procurement, it's not just about, I think commissioners have got to understand, I think it's for me there's a really common theme of it's who we're all working for and who we're answerable to.
I'm not sure whether or not you might have frozen there slightly.
Program.
That's brilliant. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, did I lose you there?
Just briefly there, we left you sort of where you were talking about the very strong link with the National Performance Framework and how it's not just about procurement, it's about having that joined up approach.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I was just going to say is also we work really closely with supply base. So we fund something called Supplier Development Programme. So anything we're doing, we're sort of running across the supply base in Scotland. We're working with, the local authorities, health, etc., central government bodies. We're sense checking all their policy development, trying to get a practical approach. We have a really good, strong governance in Scotland as well. And that's led at sort of our Director of Procurement. So he oversees both the public procurement group, which has the various sectors, health, local authority, central government, and higher and further education, and also the sort of main business orgs like FSB, chambers, things like that, who then, and third sector, who get to take a view on what we're doing and what they think we should do differently. So I think that's pretty much covers the topic.
Brilliant, thank you, Jo. Very comprehensive and really, really interesting. The reference to the kind of broader framework and also engaging with that very wide stakeholder base, really interesting, so thank you. We are going to move on now to hear from Richard Jenner, who is Programme Manager with the Welsh Local Government Association. So I'm keen to hear the approach that's happening in Wales. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andrea, and hello, group. It's nice to meet you. It's my first time on this meeting, so I hope you'll indulge me for a moment if I'm monologuing at you. And welcome to a very busy start to 2022. I sort of likened this year to being like climbing up onto the roof with a tin tray and jumping off. And that tin tray is still going along at quite a pace. Let me introduce myself and the work I'm doing as a Programme Manager for the Welsh Local Government Association. We're working at the moment on the reform of collaborative procurement in Wales as part of our work to reform procurement as a whole. And in the materials that you were sent prior to the meeting, I think there was a reference, there was only one policy reference for Wales on those papers, and it was to one of the Welsh PPNs. Can I just update you a little bit on that by saying that there is a whole raft of PPNs that apply in Wales. And in terms of procurement reform, the Welsh government approach is very similar to that in England, in that we're working on the same reforms and working quite closely with UK government. And also that the main policy driving social value in procurement is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, not the Social Value Act. And I think that's quite an important distinction to make at the beginning, because whilst the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act goes further than the English legislation, it is somewhat harder to implement. So it is a particularly ambitious piece of policy. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. So a little bit about WLGA. We are the voice of Welsh councils. We represent 22 unitary authorities in Wales and the 3 fire and rescue authorities and the 3 national park authorities as associate members. And in the WLGA, we believe that ideas that change people's lives happen locally. So communities are at the best when they feel connected to their council through local democracy. And our role is to champion, facilitate, and achieve those connections. So we're working to help communities to thrive and to be locally democratic. And ultimately, we want to promote, protect, support, and develop democratic local government and the interests of councils in Wales. So my role is to support that through procurement, all things procurement. Procurement spend in Wales is a total of about just under 7 billion, 6.98 billion. In local government, we spend 56% of that. And we realize that at this level of spend, it does command significant influence. And there are increasing expectations on councils to do more with that kind of money. So we have to deliver against a wider policy agenda in respect of decarbonisation, social value, foundational economy, and fair work. It's worth perhaps pointing out at the moment that social value in this context is, the word social perhaps is sometimes misleading. And when we're looking at value, we are looking at value in all of its forms. And again, the Wellbeing Future Generations Act helps us to define that by setting out a series of wellbeing goals, which allow us to take an outcome-focused approach to value, and perhaps look at value in a different way to, say, the conventional compliance and savings type regime that we may have used in the past. Whilst I'm talking about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, it's probably worth mentioning that the Commissioner in Wales has recently conducted a Section 20 review of procurement. And there's quite a significant library of materials available on procurement on the Commissioner's website. And that links into some of the material that we've done and some of the work we've done here at the WLGA. Our programme has been looking at procurement resourcing. And it's fair to say that the activity of procurement's been largely undervalued and under-resourced in Wales. And it's got worse over the last 7 or 8 years, directly as a result of budget cuts, and indirectly as well for councils as a result of the establishment of a national procurement service that has been reassigned to support the foundational economy rather than support procurement activity itself. And the First Minister of Wales made a statement on the repositioning of that national procurement service back in September 2018. Now, 2018 seems a very long time ago at the moment, but at that time, it provided us an opportunity to review the role of Welsh local government in establishing and managing collaborative procurement arrangements, allowing a more active role, not just for local government, but also for the wider public sector. We recognised our capacity issues, so following a review, we began looking at how we might collaborate differently around procurement. And as part of that process, we set up some regional delivery groups, Southeast, Southwest and North. And we also set up some special interest groups, one around social value, which I lead. We looked at a collaborative procurement pipeline for Wales, and decarbonisation, and specific link to the social care area of activity, which is strategically important to us. So I'll just briefly, I'm conscious of time, talk about the social value task force. Of the special interest groups, it's probably the one with the highest profile. We've 75 officers. Best way to describe them really is a coalition of the willing. And although we're a WLJ hosted group, the social value task force is from across public services, including Welsh Government, NHS, academic institutions, and other from VCSOs. So initially, that was formed to support sort of better management of added value within our procurement processes. But the task force has also identified solutions to other sort of difficult challenges around policy implementation. So we're working with Welsh Government to consider the opportunities in that. And there is considerable interest in the work outside of the procurement community. We have had 2 Welsh conferences. Both of those are accessible to you and very straightforward to Google them up. They were hosted by a consultancy called the Social Value Portal, and they maintain a recording of the conference and all the conference material. And that's available whether you're registered or not. I think you probably have to register to get in there, but that can certainly be mined for information if you want to do that. At our first conference, we had about 850. Sorry, we had more than that. I think we probably had about close to 1,000 people come to the first conference. About 850 came to the second conference, which was not that long ago in November. And we looked at a series of keynotes, panel discussions, breakouts, conferences, no different in Wales to anywhere else in the world. We had some expert panels as well that were looking at National Social Value Awards, and 7 of those 10 award categories directly related to the 7 goals of the Wellbeing Future Generations Act. So I can, if I refer you to that, if you want to have a look at that. I'm now going to stop and hand back chair, if I may, because I've monologued for long enough, I think, and perhaps we can have a conversation about anything I've raised there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. That was really, really interesting. I see we have got a question for you in the chat, but I think we'll maybe come back to that later on after we've heard from the rest of the panelists, and we can pick it up in the Q&A. But thank you. Really, really interesting. If I can pass over then to Lisa Beers, who is the Senior Social Value Advisor for the Strategic Investment Board. And Lisa's going to talk us through the approach within Northern Ireland to the issues.
Yep, thanks, Andrea. So hi, everyone. So as Andrea says, I work alongside Andrea in the Social Value Unit in the Strategic Investment Board in Northern Ireland. So I'm going to give you some very brief context as to the situation in Northern Ireland, and I'll provide some reflections on what we've done well and also probably what we could do more of. So we've been including social value in public sector contracts in Northern Ireland for some time, although initially primarily as contract performance clauses and mainly focused on employment opportunities for people who were disadvantaged in the labour market. Things have moved on considerably, and from the 1st of June this year, it'll be mandatory to allocate 10% of the award criteria to social value in services and works contracts over threshold. It's been made mandatory through policy rather than legislation for now. That may change. Social value will be scored against predetermined themes and indicators, which have all been mapped to Programme for Government outcomes in Northern Ireland. The themes and indicators were agreed by our procurement board in Northern Ireland, which is made up of industry representatives from construction industry, social economy and voluntary community sector and other industry bodies. We've been responsible in the social value unit for developing an approach to scoring social value and providing training to departments. So we've developed guidance documents on how to score social value, and we've come up with 2 different approaches that can be tailored depending on the contract. We've developed a training strategy which focused on procurement teams, contract managers, people and tender evaluation panels and suppliers. The training is currently being delivered through a series of live webinars and some pre-recorded information sessions. The live webinars have proved useful as there's been the opportunity for discussion and questions, which has allowed us to tailor the approach really depending on that feedback. We will have offered training to all public sector procurement officers in Northern Ireland affected by the policy by the end of April this year. We've used case studies, practical exercises and a video introduction by the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service in order to encourage buy-in really of the policy. Whilst the training strategy has been successful, I think we do need to do more to target commissioners, and Joe mentioned commissioners as well. So that's a common challenge for us as to how we get commissioners thinking differently and thinking early about social value from the outset. Ideally, social value training should be mandatory for commissioners, in my opinion. We have guidance on including social value at business case stage. I think this could also be strengthened. Feedback from procurement teams when we were rolling out the training was that they were concerned that suppliers weren't ready to score social value. We've therefore produced resources and training for suppliers. We also are encouraging contracting authorities to include social value at the earliest opportunity and from pre-market engagement stage, and to include links to the supplier information sessions to get the market as prepared as possible. We've developed guidance documents and model text, but we also want commissioners to think social. So it's trying to get that balance between providing resources and not doing it for people, because you do want people to think about their individual contracts and maximise the social value that can be obtained. We are trying to encourage contracting authorities to link social value to existing policy outcomes. So for example, in many of our justice contracts, they will include social value outcomes specifically related to supporting people who are at risk of offending or reoffending, for example. And we could see that right across the board. Depending on the department, we are encouraging them to tailor those initiatives to their priority areas. It's made clear to bidders either through the contract performance clauses or award questions that the social value that's been included is a Northern Ireland executive commitment and is linked to programme for government outcomes and departmental policies. We've also focused on contract managers through the training strategy, as there is a real risk that social value is included at award stage but isn't contract managed effectively. So it's one thing including social value at award stage, but what happens at the other side is equally important. And we've drawn on lots of experience of this as to what's happened when social value has been included as contract performance clauses. So getting contract managers to see that social value should be managed in the same way as any other aspect of the contract has been a challenge. And that's why we focus some of our training resources and guidance on contract managers as well. We have a monitoring system, which means that departments will be able to report on what's been achieved against the selected themes and indicators. So that will be useful because there's a lot and a huge amount of political interest in this area at the minute, and it's also going to be key for effective contract management. Finally, there's a commitment that the policy is evaluated after a year with a view to increasing the mandatory score to 20%. So it'll be important that the parameters of that evaluation are agreed and are correct. And that's all from me. Again, happy to take questions during the Q&A. Thank you, Andrea.
Brilliant, thank you. I think already there's such commonality between linking social value into broader outcomes frameworks and also that capacity building across a range of different groups, which is really interesting to hear. We are now going to turn and get an international perspective, which is great. So we're going to, it's Nandita, who is from the New South Wales government in Australia and senior policy advisor, and she's going to tell us about how it's approached within her government.
Thanks so much, Andrea. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about the New South Wales government and how social value is embedded in the procurement policy and the process. To just start with some of the spends in the last financial year, the government have spent around 37.3 billion in procurement. And out of that, the top three categories of spend were in construction, facilities management, and medical services. And in New South Wales, there's a devolved governance structure which make each agency responsible for its own procurement. And there is a procurement board. So the New South Wales Treasury is responsible to have a whole of government policy for procurement for whole of New South Wales government, but the procurement board is the agency which looks after the procurement process for each cluster or agencies. Sorry, I just forgot to ask, are you able to see my presentation?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of the objectives of the New South Wales government procurement, and some of the guiding principles are value for money, fair and open competition, easy to do business, innovation, and most importantly, economic development, social outcomes, and sustainability. But there seems to be a shift from a transactional and administrative and a compliance nature of procurement to make it more of a socioeconomic tool to drive change. And the focus of value for money has now a much more broader connotations beyond efficiency and economic to effectiveness on a whole of life basis. So in terms of with consideration to more of, how there's equity, there's environmental stewardship, there's social protection, along with transparency, fairness, and accountability. And the aim of New South Wales government through procurement is to deliver public benefits, for example, creating new business, new jobs, new skills in New South Wales. It's also about improving the supplier diversity, innovation, and resilience, and tackling climate change and reducing waste. So in terms of, there are a couple of policy levers for social procurement or to embed social value are through Aboriginal procurement policy, small and medium enterprise and regional procurement policy, Australian disability enterprises, and support for bushfire and flood affected communities. At the moment, the priority for New South Wales government is on Aboriginal procurement policy and also on small and medium enterprise and regional procurement. Some of the measures that's like in terms of the policy and targets for New South Wales government clusters, which is mandatory for New South Wales government agencies, is to spend about 1% of their total addressable spend to Aboriginal business, and 3% of total goods and services contracts to be given to Aboriginal business, and most importantly, to create 3,000 full-time equivalent employment opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people through New South Wales government procurement activities. There is also a method which is called the preference method based on financial thresholds. So for up to 250K, the agencies need to give first consideration to Aboriginal business. For a financial amount of up to 150K, the agencies can directly negotiate and engage a small, medium enterprise or a regional supplier. And for less than 3 million, agencies should give preference and directly purchase goods and services from small, medium enterprise. There is also this clause of emergency procurement. So for example, we had this bushfire in 2019 and floods in 2020. So for emergency procurement, New South Wales government agencies must use local business with the communities impacted by bushfire and floods. But the reporting targets for the agencies are mandatory for Aboriginal procurement, but not so much on the small, medium enterprise or regional or local enterprises. And in terms of the development, I must say that the nature of procurement is still pretty much pushed by different agencies and not so much a whole of government commitment to embed that social value. So it's more about a particular cluster or a particular agency pushing the agenda for social procurement or environmental sustainability than as a whole of government initiative. So as a result of that, there is New South Wales Treasury, which is the centralized body and for policy development or policy process, is trying to draft a sustainable procurement policy, which will go for cabinet approval in June 2022. And it will include social, economic, and environmental outcomes. And some of the existing policies, such as the Aboriginal procurement policy and small, medium enterprise policies, will be superseded as part of this new sustainable procurement policy. In terms of environmental considerations, KPMG did research for the New South Wales government departments, and it has labeled the government is still at a maturity level. It's still developing, so it has a long way to go. But some of the 7 environmental outcomes will be prioritized as part of the green public procurement, which will be on energy, that is reduction in energy consumption and increased use of renewable energy. In terms of air emissions, like reductions in carbon emissions, water reduction in water consumption and water pollution, and most importantly, the focus is on circular economy, which is reduction in waste generated and increase in resource recovery and reuse. In terms of the main challenge for the New South Wales government is not only a whole of government commitment towards social value or sustainable procurement, but there is a huge capability that is missing or that requires improvement in terms of mandatory training for all procurement, suppliers, and whole of government and at the cluster level. It's also about supporting the government support financial and non-financial support to suppliers for capability training. There is a huge dearth of practical toolkits or modules on the implementation of sustainable procurement to facilitate cross-cluster knowledge and information sharing, and also the recommendation is to create a central sustainable procurement hub or task force. At the moment, the challenges are in social procurement or embedding social value is a lack of clear reporting requirements, and also in terms of a misalignment between environmental objectives and procurement data to be able to be collected. And also not only for environmental objectives, but also for social procurement in terms of, for example, we have this push on Anti-Slavery Act, but there are no reporting or monitoring around it. It is, again, a very much the prerogative of a cluster or an agency to deliver that, but there is no whole of government commitment or reporting mechanisms. Limited procurement resources to collect and report on supplier procurement data and technical knowledge. I think that's where we are really lacking in terms of the capability training. The questions, and I think I've passed 5 minutes, but some of the questions that we are really interested to understand, and I had a meeting with New South Wales Treasury and the team which is responsible for the sustainable procurement policy development, and they mentioned that one of the areas that they are really looking to get inputs from the UK example is how you evaluate procurement contracts. Is there an evaluation criteria which is based on financial and non-financial criteria? And we are really interested to understand what are some of the evaluation criteria specifically on social return on investment, how we can include that as part of evaluation of contracts and procurement. The other area we are really interested, and I would like to hear from the panel, is about best practice in innovation in procurement process. And there is, I believe I understand that there is something called UK supplier flexibility and how that plays out. Also in terms of centralization and decentralization of the procurement process. Although we have a whole of government policy, but again, in New South Wales, it's a devolved governance around every agency requires to have their own procurement policy. And how does that work in other contexts and other countries? And the challenges of monitoring and reporting. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nandita. That was really interesting. Very interested as well around the preference method based approaches that you had described, and how you can really target certain contracts and sort of almost ring fence those opportunities. So that is really, really interesting. There's questions are coming through in the chat and some comments as well. I think we will turn to the response panel first of all, before we sort of open up the Q&A, just to see if there's any, I suppose, any comments or questions. Obviously, Nandita has posed a few questions that she would like to discuss as well. So I wonder if the response panel wants to comment on, I suppose, anything that you've heard overall or the queries that Nandita had raised. And also just to flag, there's a lot of conversation in the chat around, I suppose, the cost of social value and the potential to be paying more for it when you're including it in the contract, and how that should be sort of factored into evaluation. So that's maybe even something that the response panel perhaps wants to come back on. So I don't know, is there a volunteer from the response panel, or?
I'll come in, Andrea, if I may.
Thanks.
I've been itching to answer those questions. So thank you so much for asking. I'll just come back on Jackie's question first, which was around some of the other policy, non-procurement policy. I speak as a procurement specialist, so it's interesting because our group what started as looking at social value in contracting and procurement. We started looking at things like social value proxies and the use of the TOMS, the themes, outcomes and measures system that we'd seen in England being used by authorities there. And in fact, we're still piloting the use of the TOMS and some of the support services around them. And looking into those proxies, what they meant was really what motivated us at the beginning. But we soon found that colleagues from other policy areas were picking this up and realizing that that whole concept of using a social value proxy as a means of financializing what is perhaps non-financial and difficult to get hold of and perhaps considered to be fluffy was actually really useful and quite powerful. So the sort of policy areas we're looking at would include planning, so on a broad area for a local authority. But we might also talk about place-based social value, and there's a piece of work being done by one of the university health boards here, Hywel Dda Health Board, who is leading a place-based approach for West Wales, which is where I live. And they are looking at not just the health approach, but how health local authorities and other organizations within a place interact, and really how value is appreciated within that. There's also quite a lot of sectoral versus thematic difference, and we tend to take sectoral approaches. But I think when we look at it thematically, we start to open up all sorts of things. So if I can pick an area such as food, which is actually quite a tiny proportion of our spend, but is, in terms of our communities, a very important area. It's economically and socially very important to Wales. We start to open up all sorts of policy areas which aren't directly involved with procurement. So as my procurement colleagues will tell me, you tell me what to go out and buy, and I'll go out and buy it. I don't care what it is. But in putting together that requirement of what it is that you're going to buy, you have to think very carefully, and you have to really know what you're doing and why you're doing it. And the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, in linking 7 wellbeing goals of the nation to all of that procurement, and in fact we've directly mapped the TOMS proxies to the Wellbeing of Future Generations goals, allows you to take perhaps a longer term and a broader look at what it is you're buying and how much you're paying for it, and in fact what cost and value really is, as opposed to perhaps the financial numbers that sit in somebody's budget heading and how we spend cash money. And that then links to some of the later questions. I mean, Kieran made asked the question, and I think what Kieran's alluding to is really how far do you go with social value, and how do you work the percentages? There are certainly clear methodologies that we're developing or we're piloting through the TOMS for doing that. And we're looking at, instead of perhaps a cost quality type model, which is the traditional way, looking at cost, quality and social value, where you can vary the amount of social value or the percentage of social value, both to affect the evaluation, but also to signal to the market how much social value you want to see within that particular procurement. And I think in terms of an outright percentage, I think it does need a lot of local determination of exactly how that percentage should work, because different thematic requirements in procurement require different balances, and quite often it's only locally that you know what those balances are. I think Pedro also made a point there about how you specify value. And in fact, one of the lessons that we're learning is that the purpose of specification in procurement is still important. You specify what it is that you want, but the ability to specify that on an outcomes basis as opposed to a technical basis can make a big difference to what you get back. And from a provider side, providers have to know what it is that they're going to offer you. So if you're specifying social value, you're going to pay for it. It'll usually be added into the contract, and sometimes it can be an add-in. But there's also latent value and latent social value. And in fact, two different providers with very different setups and different currencies operating in their own world might come back with very different social value offers. So if I can use a very crude example there, that would be the difference between a company that is operating purely on an adversarial profit-like basis, not necessarily a bad thing, or an organization that's set up as a social enterprise where there's a collateral currency at work, which will be either involving the membership, providing a social benefit, or in fact, something to do with third-party subscriptions, such as public. So what I'm trying to say is not all providers are the same. And some providers will provide value that previously we were probably receiving, but we'd never specified it. We were just getting it anyway. And we need to be careful to protect the things that are important to us and make sure that we have, through procurement, we're not encouraging behaviors which create perverse incentives to organizations that remove social value. So I don't know if I'm articulating this particularly well. It's a massive subject and quite complex, but I think it is important that when we're using things like social value proxies, we understand those proxies are not important in their own right. They are being used as a tool within a procurement process to make a better procurement decision. And if I can just sign off with that phrase, better procurement decision, and one other, which is local impact. And that term refers to the decision that you're making as a procuring officer, is making sure that when you make a decision, understanding what the local impact of that decision is going to be in its entirety. And I don't simply mean looking at the first tier of supply, I mean looking at the entire supply chain. And another lesson we've learned is that it's the entire supply chain impact that's important, not the immediate first tier decision. So there's a whole load behind that. And sorry if I've stimulated some more chat. I can see
No, thank you.
I can't quite keep up with all of them.
A broad range of questions that are coming in through the chat. Perhaps, Gillian, Rory, any comments from the response panel, or even in relation to any of the questions that are coming through the chat, and Claire as well?
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to start off, and then it looks like Julian's probably got a thought or two. But I suppose what struck me about the conversation so far is the kind of bifurcation of the kind of unit at which we're talking about defining social value, right? So we have these higher level sort of agenda setting kind of legislative frameworks, right, that have a certain amount of democratic legitimacy because they're coming out of elected bodies, versus the definition of social value that happens amongst bureaucrats and technocrats. And so I think it's interesting to sort of begin to track and understand that there are sort of democratic accountability considerations when you're talking about defining social value amongst individuals who are not necessarily elected representatives being our way of ensuring accountability, right, to a democratic process. So understanding that this is fundamentally a technical tool that's being used to solve perhaps more political problems, and being attuned to that, I think, is a really sort of key consideration. And in the examples that we heard today, we saw a variety of different approaches of doing this, right? And sort of massive training programs to get people to appreciate how to thread national policy all the way down and whatnot, being sort of not just about writing the policy, but also having people understand what it means and how to use it in their own awards process. Relatedly, I think there's an interesting sort of difference between the procurement decision that leads to a contract award decision, and then the sort of ongoing monitoring or management of contracts that is its own mechanism for delivering value, and in particular delivering value of a more relational nature, right? So if we think about the best working kinds of ecosystems as ones that benefit from embedded relationships in addition to healthy competition, it's that sort of ongoing relationship with providers through a contract monitoring management process that is one of the key ways to build those sorts of repartees. So I'll pause there. I think maybe pass back to you, Andrea or Julian, but those were sort of the ideas that I heard sort of coming across in the different presentations.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Very helpful. Julian, do you have anything to come in at this point?
Thank you very much. Yes, it is a very big subject.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to move it away, my contribution to move it away from it being something rooted in procurement or even commissioning, and turn it into something bigger, and then take it back into the public sector perspective. My perspective is from providers of public services, basically. I act mainly for mature social enterprises, turning over between 10 and 200 million, who have acquired their role in public service provision despite all the obstacles they face. And one of the obstacles they face is that it isn't appreciated that what a social enterprise is set up to do, its whole purpose is to deliver social value. That's what it does. And a social enterprise thinks that a public service is about 100% social value, not 10% added social value. So it's the inherent social value that I would like to focus on. And I think I can just give a few examples of it, because it's a very big subject, as I say, but to start with, I would relate it to progressive economics, progressive macroeconomics. So Mariana Masakashi at UCL, who's a professor of public value, and her concept of public value, as I understand it, is saying we overvalue things that are based on cost and price and salary and monetized ways of measuring things and GDP. We undervalue things that are inherently valuable. We don't understand those things, and we don't focus on them properly. And what she's basically saying is we should organize our economics, we should organize our political economic system by reference to what we're actually trying to achieve. So we need to solve the climate crisis, we need to solve the social care crisis, we need to recover from COVID. And so we set our objective, and that is the public value we're trying to achieve. And I think that's directly comparable to micro public service management. What you're trying to do is get the best service you can possibly get, as Richard said, and you organize your resources towards that goal. That's what I think social value really means. And I'll give you an example of it, because I think, Andrew, you asked a question. So how does the set off between cost and social value work, right? Well, here's a really vivid example, I think. Group SOS is they think Anglo-Saxon style social enterprise that operates in France. And it's been in existence for about 30 to 40 years, and it started from scratch. And it started with the idea that it would be possible to address public service issues, improve the lives of the people, and save money at the same time. So they were trying to do both things at once. And the first project, as the story goes, was to provide flu treatments to homeless people, thereby saving the costs of hospitalization with pneumonia. And it worked, it was successful. So you pay a lower price to do a flu treatment to help individuals at an earlier stage, and then you move on to the next thing and their next need. And so it builds up. And the current state of Group SOS is it works across the whole of France. It's nearly a billion turnover group of companies still focused on that purpose. And I've checked up recently, a more recent example is that they developed the idea of what we used to call cottage hospitals, the intermediate provider between hospital and home. How do you care for people in the intermediate place, thereby providing benefit to people and saving costs at the same time? Here's another example. You might want me to stop shortly, but I think it's quite a well-known example, but the Mondragon example in the Basque Country in northeast Spain, that story starts in the 1950s with a 5-person workers' cooperative in reaction to the poverty of the time. And the idea was that they should set their objective as solidarity, community solidarity, or as it's currently described, employment. The objective is employment. Everything's about delivering employment to everyone. And the Mondragon Corporation is now a 4 billion turnover corporation in the Basque Country, the 7th largest corporation in the whole of Spain, based on worker cooperative models. It's got about 200 worker cooperatives and about the same number of subsidiaries. And the point is, it's illustrating the Mazzucati thesis. It's saying we focus on what we really want, employment. Every resource is geared towards that, and we achieve it. And they have very good outcomes as a result of that. And they've got integration between the economy and all the elements of the economy. The education system is geared towards providing the people who will fulfill the worker cooperative roles, and is an international education institution now. And the local government is also integrated with it. So that's an example. And what I'm really saying is, maybe I'll finish here, is that what it feels like to me in the procurement world and the commissioning world, the problem is we're so set by reference to the prevailing orthodoxy of markets, competition being the way we organize things. We're not focused on the idea that collaborative models can focus on things as well. So it's not really about monetization. It's about recognizing that there are complex things that are about real value that we find difficult to reach because they're not as easily measurable as monetized things. But they are the things we want to reach. So it's highly complex. It's all about long-term engagement and prevention and collaboration and integration, all of those things. And so these systems we're trying to reach are about setting the real objectives, mobilizing all the resources that are available for those objectives,
over that fellow, I'm leaving,
and collaborating towards those causes. And I think social value starts there. And if you have that sort of concept, we'll call it public value if you like, then you can make more sense of the sort of public sector way of dealing with these things. So final thing, social value was in the definition of best value. It wasn't the definition of value for money. It wasn't the definition of most economic advantageous tender, but it was always sort of relegated to a minor feature of those things when actually it should have had at least equal standing.
Thank you, Gillian. I think we probably needed a 4-hour session to cover all of this. So many issues and interesting conversations coming up, and there's so much in the chat as well, particularly around, people are talking contract management, financial penalties, etc. So I think that hopefully that highlights a need for a potential working group, Rory, that there's so much interest in this area. And so maybe I'll hand over to you and Myra to kind of outline the hopefully direction of travel in terms of this idea.
Yes, thanks very much. So there are lots of things going on here. There are different policies in different places, and there's so many different policies that we're talking about, whether it's the inherent value of VCSEs and logics around including and focusing on VCSEs, or it's the sort of, are we talking about environmental issues, or are we talking about jobs? And just one comment on some of the discussion that's happened already is that if we want to understand that perhaps different, if things can be effective in these different policies in different ways, then I think we need to address a lack of transparency in this area. Contracts are not published. We don't have a clear, we're not clear about what BCSEs are necessarily. Tenders tend to disappear because they're sort of hosted on third-party sites often. Things like TED or Contracts Finder tend to focus on contract notices, but none of these notices sort of include the focus on social value. So I think my comment would be that the more we try to widen public procurement to include social value and environmental goals, the less sustainable, I think, is the argument that we're talking about sort of private issues of commercial sensitivity. And we do need to think more about how do we learn about the effectiveness of these different policies in different ways. But anyway, I want to use the final minutes here to highlight that we want to continue this conversation. Next March, we will be the next session in March will be focused on engaging VCSEs, but we also want to set up a working group. That working group is to be called the Strategic Procurement Applied Research and Knowledge Sharing Working Group, SPARKS. Associated with that, we plan to have a hack and learn. These are two separate things, but the working group, we kind of like this group's opinion on what the working group should focus on for the next 6 months. We'd like your opinion on some of the logistics around the working group. There are many other working groups in this area, and we'd like to be complementary to those. So your feedback on some of these things are helpful. And then Mara's going to say something about hack and learn. Can we go to the poll to get? I'm conscious of the time here. So, and if Lee, if you wanted to move the slide back a little bit. So for thinking about a working group, we did 2 working groups last year. Those involved in POGO Club last year will recall we did a working group around the green paper, and we did a working group around social impact bond templates. Think about a working group here about the sort of strategic use of public procurement. We want to ask if people have a sense of what areas this working group should focus on. And so I'll pause there so people can give responses. If that's okay. To elaborate on the second question, we're thinking about doing a meeting sort of once a month, every second Tuesday of the month for about 6 months. The first such working group would be on March 8th. We'd like to continue on to dig into some of these important issues that people have raised in some of these questions. Should we go to the next item? Is there the next item for the poll, or all 3 questions are there? Okay, the hack and learn. Mara, do you want to say something about the hack and learn?
Yes, sure. I'll be really brief. So hi everyone. The Hack and Learn is an event hosted by the Go Lab twice a year, in which we bring together practitioners. Yeah, I think we lost the slides. Sorry. Practitioners, researchers, students. We bring different people together to work on challenges. And one of the challenges in the next Hack and Learn will be related to the SPARKS working group. The challenge will be focused on the outcomes frameworks and strategic procurement, which was the first topic that Rory mentioned earlier. And the Hack and Learn will start on March 24 and will go on for 2 weeks until April 7. And the Hack and Learn and the working group are 2 separate things. So it's not mandatory to participate on the Hack and Learn if you want to join the working group. But of course, you will all be very welcome to join us if you're interested. I'm going to post the link with more information on the chat so you can take a better look. Thank you.
Thanks. I think Anne is going to come in here in our final minute as well. But one of the things we want to do here is to thank Lee. Lee Crawley has been for the last year helping at this POGO group. And I think a lot of you will have seen that our processes and our methods of engagement have improved. But Lee is leaving the Go Lab. So this is an opportunity to thank Lee, I think. This is his final session as a Go Labber. Hopefully he'll continue to be involved. We have something to present to Lee. Is that available? Hello. Anne, we're handing over to you here.
Massive thanks to Lee, who makes everything run smoothly behind the scenes. Many of you will have had dealings with him with registration and Zoom and all of those kinds of things. And this brilliant idea is Rory's. It is, of course, what else could we get but a pogo stick? So we hope that you will enjoy that. And we hope that you will also rejoin the POGO Club in wherever life takes you in the future. So thank you very much for doing a brilliant job for us over the past year, and enjoy your pogo stick. Thank you very much, everyone, for today.
Well, thank you very much. I will be bouncing around Oxford and then over in Portland, Oregon, US, and causing havoc.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks to all of our panelists today, everyone who's participated, for the great contributions in the chat. And thank you to Andrea for putting it all together and holding the ring today. Thank you, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you all in March.